Okay, welcome back to room there. I read old magazines. We are going to be dealing with the issue of Dyer, traditionalism. Um, Maybe get slightly into Le Cercle, Opus Dei, E. Michael Jones, Charles Colombe, tradition, family, and property. All of these individuals that are part of the monarchist revolution of the new right. Um, it's very hard to know exactly where to start with these issues because the current territory right now, the current major issue is the Alexander Dugin influence over these circles that are associated with Julius Evola fascism. But principally, I've documented, I've diagrammed that all of these ideological currents have their common nexus in French Martinism, which derives from the Cathar cult. Now, this is partially a response to Dyer, who claims, oh, he hates traditional Catholicism, oh, he doesn't believe in traditionalism, he doesn't believe in perennialism, that this is rejected by orthodoxy. And that's very true. Absolutely. But that's not what I was blocked by Dyer on Twitter. That's not what I had said. I didn't say that he was a traditionalist um, in the perennial sense, but rather he's a traditionalist in the occult Martinist Catholic sense that Joseph de Maistre, the counter-revolutionary count uh, involved in the Madame de Stael salons that helped create Napoleon and who also egged on the Jacobin Terror, um, he created his own form of Catholicism, which is now uh, trickled down into basically every facet of traditional Catholicism, conservatism, fascist movements, and into traditional orthodoxy as well. And I've documented all of this, um, at least in terms of an ideological currents. And I have a image file that I'll make available for you concerning this issue. But as far as Jay Dyer saying that he doesn't believe in perennialism, the traditionalism of Joseph de Maistre, here we'll read the Wikipedia article on it. Here's some Zoomer tier shite right here. All right. Now, the interesting thing about this in a larger context is that it was the French Martinists that also created the concept of modernité under Charles Baudelaire, the French symbolist poet who supposedly was influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think so. I think Poe uses metaphor, not symbology, predominantly. But Charles Baudelaire coined the term modernity and coined it as the tradition of the new, the tradition of the novel, kind of a worship of cosmopolitan life. Uh, and this is actually what St. Pius X, um, he might have not known exactly contextually what he was targeting, but he was targeting both theological modernism as well as um, modernistic art and culture. And it comes out of this salon system, which is literally called the Rose and Cross Salon. It's a Rosicrucian French Martinist movement of French symbolism. Now, we're going to just read about traditionalism in the 19th century Catholicism, because this was also condemned heresy, just like modernism. Um, they both come from the same branch. And this was condemned at Vatican I. So all of the so called rad trads that are so heavily for monarchy and against republicanism, etc., and Um, well, let's just read. Traditionalism in the context of 19th century Catholicism refers to a theory which held that all metaphysical, moral, and religious knowledge derives from God's revelation to man and is handed down in an unbroken chain of tradition. Now, this is almost like orthodoxy um, in terms of how, if you look how Dyer uses church father arguments, he'll pick these individuals. Um, but Dyer completely rejects natural philosophy of either Duns Scotus or Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. Now, if you're incapable of making moral, metaphysical, religious knowledge from philosophy, you pretty much need to have some sort of theocratic society. And this is the kinds of things that Dyer and his counterparts that he pretends to reject on the Catholic side. Um, this is the kind of reasonable ability that they reject exists. Um, as for Joseph de Maistre, he actually wanted this movement. Now his idea of traditionalism was condemned, but Joseph de Maistre is one of those critical people for the movement of French Martinism into Russia because he was a um, working in the court, I believe, in St. Petersburg, and had discussions with Russian politicians at the time, Russian nobility. Ah, I'm being attacked by ruthless Dyer nerds. They've doxed me already. Okay. Um, but his idea was to create a condominium between, or really to heal the schism of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church under this idea. So it would actually be a concession and a denial of natural theology and all of that. It would be exactly what the Orthodox want, but they'd call it Catholicism. Of course, it would be under the Pope, too. So it's one of those give and take kind of syncretic movements. But going on, this traditionalism denied that human reason by itself had the power to attain to any truths in these domains of knowledge, that is, metaphysical, moral, and religious knowledge. It arose mainly in Belgium and France as a reaction to 18th century rationalism and can be considered an extreme form of anti rationalism. Now, Belgium and France are the largest targeted um, populations for Alexander Dugin's fascism. These are the populations around people like, I think his name is Alan de Benoist, um, who founded the GRECE or is principal to the GRCE. And these are the people that follow Evolian fascism, which don't take that as a right wing movement because they also look up to people like Antonio Gramsci and all sorts of communist Marxist people, etc. There's so much going on here that I'm not going to try to go too in depth into it. But so you have Belgium and France as kind of these principal areas of these ideas. And then in Britain, you already kind of have Fabian socialism and stuff interfacing with these ideas. And then you have the Russian Martinists and those circles, what can be called the Lenin Library Circle, that is directly responsible for around George Gurdjieff, um, that is directly responsible for Alexander Dugin and Alexander Dugin getting introduced to Julius Evola. And then you have this kind of sophiology circles. In sophiology is the study, basically, they want to put a fourth person in the Trinity, which is the Holy Mother. Um, Different concept than co-redemptrix if you're familiar with Catholic theology. But these sophiology circles interfaced heavily with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and were also um, interfacing with the Russian symbologists, but these are the people that are critical to creating the Russian idea, which led to the doctrines of Sovietism. Sovietism was not just Marxism. People always mistake it and say it's all about communism, but the other side is the Russian idea. And this is why Soviet Union did not have quite the anti-art, anti. I mean, they were basically National Socialists. They didn't have the same concept that the left in the United States, which was backed by Congress of Cultural Freedom and the Fabians, they didn't have that same conception. They were both extremely nationalist as and internationalist. They wanted to spread the Russian Empire. And this is the same thing that Alexander Dugin wants to do today. He wants Russian Eurasian Empire from Vladivostok to Dublin, I think. So, but going on, because we're still on this Wikipedia article here. I don't even know. Yeah, I still have a backer. Not in the perfect thirds, but whatever. Um, yeah, I see I have 3 followers. Thanks a lot for being here. I'm gonna try to condense this stuff down into blog format or something like that later on. Um, Especially if I need to go on and talk to John Brisson. I've been invited by John Brisson. Um, I'm gonna have to be able to condense this. So, but the chief proponents of this traditionalism were Joseph de Maistre, who is this French Martinist that basically gives birth to Napoleon, gives birth to Rene Guénon, who is this Catholic mystic who converted to Sufism, inspires Julius Evola, down the line. And then you have Louis de Bonald, and then you have Hugues Felicité Robert de Lamennais, who was a Catholic priest, simultaneously holding traditionalism, and also being the forerunner to what is called liberal Catholicism and social Catholicism. Their doctrines were advocated in modified form by Louis Eugene Marion Bottain, Augustine Bonetti, and Casimir Ubaz, and the philosophers of the Louvain school. The fundamental distrust of human reason underlying traditionalism was eventually condemned in a number of papal decrees and finally ruled out by the dogmatic constitution Dei Filius during the First Vatican Council in 1870. Now, remember, this is traditionalism, and on the other hand, you have modernité coming out of French modernism through the poet Charles Baudelaire. And now, of course, the modernist schools of theology were, I think, inspired by other Rosicrucians and Freemasons and things like this. It actually doesn't get a name until Charles Baudelaire, and they apply it to what's basically German higher criticism and Paris. I think there's a couple Parisian theologians specifically that were the target of Pius X's denunciation of modernism, condemnation of modernism. And there's actually a French symbolist poet that writes a poem that is stupid. It says, "No, you, Pius X, are modernist because you have type, I don't know, you live in," basically saying he lives in the middle of the city. He has all of this media surrounding him and coming into the. It's a poem that it more reads just like political propaganda, but it's French symbolist poetry, and it's a direct response to this condemnation of modernism, and that's the entire basis of traditionalism in the 20th and 21st century is the fight against modernism. So there's a problem here that it took on the same name as this heresy that stems from these Martinist currents. The major point I want to make about J. Dyer was this. Um, if you look into how the modern currents of thought around the Orthodox have been formed, Um, there's, like I said, there's a chart that I made up, make this easy to understand. Um, the whole Russian idea thing, the Russian ideology that's still alive today and still very much underlies their idea of, well, we need monarchy, we need um, this imperium, we need this and that and the other thing, comes from Martinism. Now, old Orthodoxy might have had this idea, but these circles, these tightly packed salon circles around St. Petersburg and around the Sophiology movement are what really pushed this idea. And if you look at somebody like Mark Hackard or the other guy that writes for Soul of the East, which Jay Dyer now owns, all of their influences, namely Joseph de Maistre, but then these other individuals associated with these schools, I'll read them off to you once I get my chart up. All of these individuals associated with these schools are their influences. It's not older Russian philosophers. I don't think there's many to begin with, but it's not these older Russian philosophers. It is really these schools that descend from Russian Martinism. Um, and so you see the same thing with E. Michael Jones. You see the same thing with um, Charles Coulombe. Charles Coulombe actually writes a defense of Joseph de Maistre, which we're going to read soon. E. Michael Jones, one of his big things in theology is I think he was debating some pagans, which he likes to debate pagans. He likes to go on to press TV, and he likes to praise the lunatics in Iran, etc. Very, very reminiscent of and he likes to quote the main theocratic cleric in Iran. Forget his name. That America is the great Satan. He likes to go off about these kinds of things. Um, but one of his arguments against this pagan was that man has shame because a man was having sex out in the open underneath the sky and he hears thunder and he suddenly feels shame and he goes into a cave. And this is not a theological point. This is a very strange non Christian point that he always makes, but it's tied back to the concept of the thunder god. And there's an article about that which we're going to read. Because this thunder god concept is central to this movement that's leading out of Catharism, the Cathar cult in France, to Martinism, um, going as far as the uh, around the Fabians, the distributionists, who Cecil Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton's brother, co-edited the paper "The New Age" with the Fabian socialist Alfred Orage. I'm still trying to find this thing. I use a program called Me Mind to link all of these ideas together. I paid like $6 for something that's really super useful. But he always uses this thunder god concept. This is something that comes from de Maistre, and he generally has this de Maistre idea of how things work. Now, E. Michael Jones is not the worst of the worst, but I think he kind of represents what Executive Intelligence Review revealed as the merger between the Fabian socialists, distributionists, and the Nashville agrarians in the United States. But back to the main influencers of Alexander Dugin, and I think the Russian idea and Jay Dyer, you have Vladimir Solovyov, Pavel Florensky, Sergius Bulgakov. Now, Pavel and Sergius aren't nearly as important, but those are your sociologists. Then you have Ivanov and you have Nikolai Berdyaev. And those two individuals are probably Ivanov, Solovyov, and Berdyaev are probably three of the most influential Russian nationalist, Russian imperial um, individuals. And I want to go through this entire thing from the head down um, later on because there's a lot of particular things particular to these individuals that show that they're not really these uh, religious idols. They're more kind of Nietzschean, Martinist type individuals. Um, like Solovyov was an Orthodox individual, gets converted to nihilism by Nietzsche, and then Tolstoy actually brings him back into Orthodoxy. Um, he argues against the positivists, but then he supports Roman Catholicism, which is kind of typical of this Martinist plan to merge these two religions. Um, he's a campaigner for Jewish culture and against Jewish culture in Russia, the persecution of Jewish culture in Russia. He was a vegan, and he slept with multiple women named Sophia um, as his muses, and was never able to actually marry a woman or anything like that. He proposed a syncretic philosophy merging orthodoxy and Kabbalah, and he creates what's called the Russian idea in 1888. And this is one of Mark Hackard's fundamental influences, as well as Alexander Dugin's fundamental influences. And might I remind you, this is the website that Dyer originally kind of was introduced to the circles around Soul of the East through, and Dyer now owns this website. Um, and Dostoevsky is kind of conceptualized as or understood as creating the messianic imperialism of Russia, which is heavily influential on Sovietism. Now, Dyer kind of comes from, I think, another wing of this whole thing within Orthodoxy, and that's when you have George Gurdjieff, who created the Lenin Library Company, or who was the basis for the Lenin Library Company that influenced Alexander Dugin. George Gurdjieff goes with Peter Ouspensky to Britain, and Peter Ouspensky um, also goes there to do lecture series. And he inspires a lot of Fabian socialists, as well as the Hamsworth family that ran the Daily Mail, ran British intelligence operations, um, ran the Daily Mail in order to support fascists, Oswald Mosley and those individuals. But he also directly influenced A.R. Orge, who worked with Cecil Chesterton on the New Age magazine, where distributionism was originally introduced to the public. So you have this George Gurdjieff guy, and if you don't know Gurdjieff, he's an occultist out of Russian Martinism, Theosophy, etc. He's the origin of Alexander Dugin's fourth political theory. Him and Peter Ouspensky, they founded the Four Ways of Living. And Alexander Dugin has the four political theory, and the sociologists have the fourth person of the Trinity. There's something going on with the number four throughout all these occult circles. It's very strange. Um, but so Ouspensky goes to Britain, influences all these British establishment individuals on both the Fabian socialist side and the fascist side. And one in particular, Dmitry Mitronovic, is the mentor of Alan Watts. Alan Watts trains Father Seraphim Rose, who was already a disciple of René Guénon, who was the successor of Joseph de Maistre, and who proposed a merger between Roman Catholicism and Freemasonry. Father Seraphim Rose has these two major, and this is J. Dyer's fundamental teacher on most of the Orthodox fundamentals. Father Seraphim Rose graduates from Alan Watts School on East Asian Theology Studies. And there's letters from Father Seraphim Rose where he's still in praise of Rene Guénon for Rene Guénon's influence on his spiritual path. And so J. Dyer is kind of in a different circle. This is something that comes out of kind of a more remote part of these circles through Britain and through the white emigre, what was called the white emigre of Russia, who go and found the Rochon Church, which is the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. It's called Rochon. Now they will profess forever and always to be completely anti-Soviet, and the Moscow patriarchate is full of KGB agents, etc., etc. But what these individuals don't realize is the real intelligentsia or the real authors of the modern fascist movements, as well as the Soviet imperial messianic complex, were these same individuals that helped to bring about this concept. It helped bring about Dugin. These people that they reject, okay, I'm getting a little. This is currently an Ember Day, so I'm fasting, so I can't really think as well as I usually do. But let's start again. J. Dyer falls into all these circles. He's maybe not he's anti-communist, anti-Soviet / Republican. Jay believes they both mean the same thing. I would beg to call that a word concept fallacy, as Jay always says. But Jay is being influenced by the same people that influenced the other bad side of the Soviet Empire. You had communism, but you also had the Russian messianic imperialist complex. And that's what J. Dyer falls into, and that's the same ideology as Alexander Dugin. Jay doesn't agree with all of the satanic aspects of Dugin, but I think that that's not Dugin's prerogative. Dugin doesn't want people to agree with him. He wants them to act based on their own natural ideologies, in a sense, to create chaos, um, to create destabilization, to create a burnover so that Russian imperialism, Russian influence can expand. And what Jay Dyer is doing is perfectly serving that agenda. Especially Jay Dyer doesn't go through and do entire debunkings of Dugin or anything like that. He doesn't really do the um, anti-Russian Rochor line like some of the hardcore Rochors or the people from Rochor that don't are against the Moscow Rochor merger. Um, so I think we've pretty much covered the ideas in this chart. I don't have much on E. Michael Jones, but except that he's kind of derivative of this. What's up, John? Um, I don't have much in terms of E. Michael Jones at this moment. I didn't want this to be a long video, more to focus on J. Dyer and the idea of Catholic traditionalism from the 19th century concept. Um, don't get that confused with the 20th century concept. The 20th century concept is derivative, but it's not the same. It's not heretical. It's okay to go to Latin Mass. You should go to Latin Mass. It's the law of the church, etc., etc. But I mean, Charles Colombe's one of these big guys. He claims to hate the Habsburgs. Charles Colombe is this knight in the Catholic Church, one of the Order of the Garter or something. Um, I'm gonna look him up here. Knight of Saint Sylvester. He's part of the International Monarchist League, and he writes very favorably of Joseph de Maistre. He operates in parallel with the tradition, family, and property movements, um, which are known as the child of Plinio de Oliveira. I believe he's a Brazilian nobleman or pretended to be nobleman. Basically, pro monarchist who was also advocating kind of a super race of trad cat individuals, but not based on racism, but based on uh, nobleness, whatever that means. But Charles Colombe is one of these big guys that goes around and does speeches and advocates for a monarchy in the USA, and sometimes defends the Habsburgs. Other times they have to kind of remove themselves from the Habsburgs because of all of the embarrassing stuff that the Habsburgs did. Um, but if the secret here is that almost all of these families that are here today, whether they pick the Habsburgs or the British royal family or this or that, even James II, all of these individuals are married into the Guelph main branch, which is ironically named the Malaspina family. And I believe one of their crests is the thorn tree. The other is the same crest that tradition family property uses, which is the lion with the crown and clawing at a thorn bush. The Malaspina family were from the Lombards who created the Lombard banking system. Um, at times held the church captive. I think at times they founded in Venice the Arian patriarchates, two Arian patriarchates. But they also, the Malaspinas killed the Pope. I think they warred against other popes. Just this absolutely terrible family that, for some reason, these individuals think is the epitome of Catholic nobility. I don't know, but I try to expose these people on Twitter and shoot things just in case somebody with an open mind is watching, because there's so much bullshit out there on in social media of all these Catholic LARPers. And if you read down a list, I just saved a list of the Catholic thinkers. A lot of them are these modern Catholic thinkers who just like put out simple truisms, and it's like, oh, these are the greatest Catholic thinkers ever, or they just LARP, they wear a bow tie or whatever. Uh, let's see. So there's this guy, Nadernaut at Nadernaut7. E. Michael Jones got me interested in Roman Catholicism, but it was Scott Hahn and Taylor Marshall who nearly had me convinced it was legitimate. I'm back to my original point of view, though, thanks to Dyer, Eastern Orthodoxy's historical Christianity. And he quotes this other individual that has all these LARPer things. I mean, he's Chinese, Japanese, all sorts of stuff in his name, but it's Carolus XIX, and he has a picture of all these individuals and then their names: Bishop Barron, Father Chad Ripberger, James Lakudis, Edward Facer, Joseph Nicolosi, Peter Kreeft, Wolfgang Schmidt, Scott Hahn, Douglas Beaumont, Thomas Madden, Steve Weidenkopf, and then he has Nick Fuentes, Charles Coulombe, Pat Buchanan, E. Michael Jones, Robert Sugenis, Charles Coughlin, Dennis Fahey, Felix Salvini, Heinrich Pesch, Joseph de Maistre, Juan Cortez, Charles Morris, G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, Antonio Salazar, Russell Kirk, Nicholas Davila. People who are all over the sphere in terms of Catholic thought and um, the political spectrum. and somehow these are supposed to be true right wing thinkers. And I mean, that's just the conception of what a person on the street is thinking, or a person that's around in these movements. Um, it's just crazy, like that they're going to integrate all of these ideas together and formulate in their mind their own worldview. Um, Despite the fact that many of these people are in contrast to one another. Um, a lot of these people are Opus Dei, though. It's something that I briefly wanted to get into. Um, yeah, yeah, John. I don't have streaming stuff yet, but I'm reading you. You're right. John Brisson says many of these individuals are connected to the Knights of Malta, Jesuits, and the CNP. They're also connected to the Opus Dei in the Le Circle group. Um, it's so nebulous that there's no way to capture the idea or the actual groups. You have to look at the ideology, like the ideological currents. That's the best way to do it. But the or that's how I'm trying to do it. If you debunk the idea, you can cut the Gordian knot and have people stop following this garbage. Um, but there's an interesting book I found by David Teacher called Rogue Agents, Habsburgs, Panay, and the Private Cold War, 1951 to 1991. I want to look into that and share that with you guys. Now, if you don't know, the connection between Charles Colombe and Tradition Family Property, this Plinio de Oliveira guy, and all of this, is that they are basically the Tradition Family Property people are basically a project of the Braganza family, who are the Spanish wing of the Ternataxis family, were the intelligence front for the Habsburgs. Um, Once again, Guelph families descended from the Malaspinas, and I guess the older the line and the more removed from what could be seen as lower forms of politics, the better you have repute within these traditionalist Catholic circles. So I think the Ternataxis people are looked on a little more favorably than the Habsburgs at this point. But I want to do some Randy Angle exposés too, because her expose on E. Michael Jones and Michael Vors are great, tying them to Opus Dei. But there's also something called the Narnia Clubs, which is around C.S. Lewis and the distributionists and those individuals that are influenced by, I think, French Martinism and symbolism, the symbolist movement. Um, but this is a takeover of something called the Narnia Club by the Opus Dei. An article called "Are You Impressive Enough to Be Co-opted by the Opus Dei?" Randy Engel tells us what we're in for. Watch out for Narnia clubs. And like I said, this is nebulous. You can find all sorts of different branches leading off of this and follow them. I'm trying to stay as close to the trunk of the tree as possible. Um, so let's talk about the thumbnail, because that's another instance of Michael Jones. Um, Corruption is that the priest you see with a finger over his hand, that is an Opus Dei priest that had a media apostolate. And this priest was Michael Force's, another Catholic media guy. That was his spiritual advisor. He basically took the secrets from Michael Force's life and told all of this stuff to E. Michael Jones, who is connected to Opus Dei through Mark Brammer. It's kind of a demonstration of how Opus Dei blackmails people through spiritual direction, etc. Um, I want to do an entire segment on Le Circle and Opus Dei later on, but E. Michael Jones. Thunder God. But this article about the Thunder God will kind of tie E. Michael Jones into that. I mentioned Charles Colombe because he's just somebody who's trying to get a monarchist revolution. And just like Joseph de Maistre, he's an ultramontane and a monarchist and all of these things. But none of these people, also, none of these people, I go on Twitter and I talk to all these Catholics, tradcat individuals, and you send them things. Joseph de Maistre is this admitted Freemason. He is like the fourth pillar of Martinism alongside Claude Saint Martin and all of these other individuals. Um, Founder of Synarchy, Saint Ivas wanted to postulated ruling humanity through a group of secret societies. Um, but like John Horvat and these individuals, John Horvat II, um, you send something like this whenever they quote de Maistre and they don't send anything back. They ignore it. I've had people block me about this issue. Now, the curious thing is, I mention this and I get my comment liked by a Twitter user that is an integralist, which is derivative of Julius Evola and these fascist movements. But then he's fascist, but he's pro Jesuit, pro Francis Bergoglio. People don't understand those politics down there either. The Jesuits supported both sides, whoever they could, to destabilize the countries down there as part of a multifaceted, four-dimensional chess movement. So, I'm looking through my tweets. Like here's an example of Joseph de Maistre, and I guess we're gonna read. Let's say this is the second part of this little demonstration. We're gonna read about Catharism. We're gonna read then about the Cultural Congress, Cultural Freedom, Congress of Cultural Freedom, in the Thunder God, and then we'll go from there. But here's this quote first from Joseph de Maistre. Maybe I have it in my photos instead of looking for freaking dumbass Twitter. Um, Joseph de Maistre. All grandeur, all power, and all subordination to authority rests on the executioner. He is the horror and bond of the human association. Remove this incomprehensible agent from the world, and at that very moment, order gives way to chaos. Thrones topple, and society disappears. So, God isn't the ultimate bond. The Holy Spirit isn't the bond of human association. Reason isn't the bond of human association. It's the executioner. And this is in praise of the Jacobin terror, as what people deserved in the French Revolution, despite the fact that the revolution of John Sylvain Bailly and the Marquis de Lafayette were constitutional monarchy, and things were fine. These ultramontane monarchists said, no, we don't want a constitution. We don't want this. They set the Jacobin terror into motion in line with some help from the British and the Swiss, and then they blamed it on the people. And this is something you hear oftentimes in traditionalist circles, is it's always, well, the church is failing because of the laity. And in some sense, that can be construed as true, but it's always, it's not. It's not good enough when you blame the laity, but then you don't go and reveal these critical heresies and ideological movements that keep causing this terror. Here's another Joseph de Maistre. There's an occult quote from him. The whole earth perpetually steeped in blood is nothing but an immense altar on which every living thing must be sacrificed, without end, without restraint, without respite, until the consummation of the world, the extinction of evil, the death of the death. Now, this is a Kantian philosophy, the negation of the negation, which is also one of the main ideological currents for theological modernism, and specifically the schools that Pius X was targeting. And here's Joseph de Maistre praising the Russians, which, remember, de Maistre critical to bringing Martinism from France to Russia, along with some other associates. There is no man who desires as passionately as a Russian. If we could imprison a Russian desire beneath a fortress, that fortress would explode. And such they did. Um, so let's read about Catharism. And I'm sorry if anybody's talking in the chat. I can't see it because I don't have my software yet to stream. Catharism, the pure ones, was a heretical Christian dualist or Gnostic revival movement that thrived in some areas of southern Europe, particularly what is now known as northern Italy and southern France, between the 12th and 14th centuries. I think that's under Pope. It's the same Pope that convened the Fourth Crusade, I believe. The followers were known as Cathars and are now mainly remembered for a prolonged period of persecution by the Catholic Church, which did not recognize their belief as being Christian. Catharism appeared in Europe in the Languedoc region of France in the 11th century, and this is when the name first appears. The adherents were sometimes known as Albigensians after the city Albi in southern France, where the movement first took hold. The belief system may have originated in Persia or the Byzantine Empire. Catharism was initially taught by ascetic leaders who set few guidelines, and thus some Catharist practices and beliefs varied by region and over time. The Catholic Church denounced the practices, including the consolamentum ritual by which Cathar individuals were baptized and raised to the status of perfect. So I know there's some Protestants watching probably, but that's where that idea comes from. Uh, Catharism may have its roots in the Paulician movement in Armenia and Eastern Byzantine Anatolia, and certainly in the Bogomils of the First Bulgarian Empire. Um, from the beginning of his reign, Pope Innocent III attempted to end Catharism by sending missionaries and by persuading the local authorities to act against them. In 1208, Innocent's papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was murdered while returning to Rome after excommunicating Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who, in his view, was too lenient with the Cathars. Pope Innocent then abandoned the option of sending Catholic missionaries and jurists, declared Pierre de Castelnau a martyr, and launched the Albigensian Crusade, which all but ended Catharism. So I believe that's the Fourth Crusade, correct? Let me check something. Maybe it's the fifth. Yeah, see, that's a little strange. But so the SS, the Nazis were obsessed with these Cathar castles, and despite the fact that people like Maria Theresa Horvat and John Horvat of Tradition, Family, and Properties subsect Tradition and Action, despite the fact that these individuals condemn the Nazis because of the Nazis' love for Catharism, the Martinist romanticization of Catharism, they kind of accept that idea in some sense. I don't. Is this a numbered crusade though? That's what I don't get. Because the Fourth Crusade is from 1202 to 1204. The Albigensian Crusade is from 1209 to 1215. So I imagine it's the Fifth Crusade. Now, the Fourth Crusade was also convened by Pope Innocent III, and that was on behalf of the Venetians, who were working with the Byzantines. So, to displace another faction of the Byzantines. So the J. Dyer always brings up the Fourth Crusade. That's complete garbage. If you believe in the because they believe in the divine right of their rulers, in some sense, not in the sense that it is in the West, but if this is like your King David, and you've thrown him off the throne, and he goes and gets help from outside, and then he comes in and sacks the city, I don't understand how that's the fault of the West. In the 8th century AD, also notes of an earlier sect called the Cathari in his book on heresies taken from the epitome provided by Epiphanius of Salamis and Panarion. He says of them, they absolutely reject those who marry a second time and reject the possibility of penance, that is, the forgiveness of sins after baptism. These are probably the same Cathari, actually Novatians, who are mentioned in Canon 8 of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea and the year 325, which states, if those so-called Cathari come over to the faith, let them first make profession that they are willing to communicate, share full communion with the twice married, and grant. It's not really important, but it's an idea that goes back very far to the 8th century and before. It is now generally agreed by most scholars that identifiable historical Catharism did not emerge until at least 1143, when the first confirmed report of a group espousing similar beliefs is reported being active at Coloumbe by the cleric Eberwin of Steinfeld. A landmark in the institutional history of Cathars was the council, held in 1167 at Saint Philly, Larragay, attended by many local figures and also by Bogomil Papa Nicetes, the Cathar bishop of northern France and a leader of the Cathars of Lombardy. So there's the Lombards again. The Cathars were largely local Western European Latin Christian phenomenon spring up in the Rhineland cities, particularly Cologne, in the mid 12th century, northern France around the same time, and particularly in Languedoc, and the northern Italian cities in the mid late 12th century. In the Languedoc and northern Italy, the Cathars attained their greatest popularity, surviving in the Languedoc in the most reduced form up around to 1325, and in the Italian cities until the Inquisitions of the 14th century finally extirpated them. And you always hear about the Inquisition getting rid of the Jews and how that's great. You don't hear so much about the Inquisitions getting rid of these heretics that were actually probably the largest influencers of the issues of the day. Um, so here's their theology. Cathar cosmology identified two twin opposing deities. The first was a good God portrayed in the New Testament and creator of the spirit, while the second was an evil God depicted in the Old Testament and creator of matter in the physical world. The latter, often called Rex Mundi, king of the world, was identified as the god of Judaism and was either conflated with Satan or considered Satan's father, creator, or seducer. They solved the problem of evil by stating that the good God's power to do good was limited by the evil God's work, and vice versa. Now, interestingly enough, the Swabians and Lombards and all of these um, Anglo Frankish tribes claim to be founded kind of like Romulus and Remus by two twins, the Gemini type twins. Um, and Thomas Jefferson, who was very much a British, almost a British loyalist, but in a sense Luciferian, and he was more of the faction that wanted the United States to be a new land of libertarian kind of serfdom, in a sense. Oh, he was also very very much in agreement with this idea that the successive revolutions and the blood of successive revolutionaries have to be the driving force of um, of the American government in the future. Um, he actually advocated that the Lombard Gemini twins be on the Great Seal when the Great Seal was being made, and that's a very Martinist idea. Um, the successive revolutions and the successive blood being spilled, just like the altar, the idea of the world being an altar that Joseph de Maistre talks about in lauding the Jacobin terror. Uh, all visible matter, including the human body, was created by the Rex Mundi. Matter was therefore tainted with sin. Under the view, humans were actually angels seduced by Satan before a war in heaven against an army of Michael, after which they would have been forced to spend an eternity trapped in the evil god's material realm. Uh, until one was Cathars taught that to regain angelic status, one had to renounce the material self completely. Until one was prepared to do so, they would be stuck in a cycle of reincarnation, condemned to live on a corrupt earth. Zoe Oldenburg compared the Cathars to Western Buddhists because she considered that in their view of doctrine of resurrection taught by Christ was similar to the Buddhist doctrine of rebirth. Uh, Now, Pierre Beaudry, who is one of these LaRouche guys, um, wrote a book called Synarchy Studies that goes into more in depth to the Cathars, Joseph de Maistre, the French Revolution, basically everything related to the French Revolution. Now, not all of it's always completely accurate, but it's a good framework for this whole thing. So we're going to look over his work on modernism or Martinism first, and then uh, we'll go to the CCF and the Thunder God article. Okay, okay, here's a heading within Synarchy Book 1 by Pierre Beaudry, The Religious Fanaticism of the Martinist Cult. If someone wishes to discover the cause of the occurrence of religious terrorist cults endangering civilization today, the first place they must look into is Gnosticism and its different offshoots. During the so called religious war that engulfed Europe from the time of purgative violence of executioner Thomas Torquemada and his expulsion of the Jews in 1492 to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, religious conflicts had become the fuel of warfare which had been orchestrated systematically by the Venetian controlled Habsburg Empire from both Austria and Spain. Those differences, however, were not significant enough to keep the war going for 1,000 years. I will mention right now also there's a group associated with Martinism called the Priory of Zion. They believe that the Habsburgs are the descendants of Christ. Which who else would create such a cult other than the Habsburgs? During the 1648 1789 period of relative peace of the continent of Europe, religious cults outside the Catholic Protestant denominations were being organized in and around Freemasonic secret societies representing a variety of Gnostic, quasi Jewish, Christian Cathars, and straight pagan cults, which were directly involved in launching the violence of the French Revolution and have represented an explicit danger to the progress of European Western civilization, and specifically a threat to the continuation of the constitutional republic of the United States today. It is such a Gnostic Roman Empire type of resurgence represented by the Neo-Cathar Martinist order in alliance with the commercial banking family interests of such as the Barings Bank, Lazard Ferris, and the Rothschild family interest, and so forth, which are still at the heart of world terrorism today, much in the same manner that the Mithra cult and the Venetian banking families did in fueling European religious warfare during the 16th and 17th centuries. This Gnostic threat represents much more profound differences with Christianity than did the Catholic Protestant conflicts of the so called European religious wars. The current oligarchy, just as their predecessors of the past 2,000 years, consider that Christianity has been an unjust usurpation of classical tradition of Rome, a crime of lese majesty to the authority of the empire. Instead of regarding the Italian Renaissance as a great achievement in the progress of Christian civilization, as it was truly, the imperialist faction of the European oligarchy saw the great breakthrough of Nicholas of Cusa and the subsequent emergence of the nation state under Louis XI of France and Henry VII of England as the great setback for the tradition of the indivisible authority of Rome and its Pax Romana, primarily because it represented the emergence of a new set of laws based on the fostering of the common good and general welfare of all the people. Uh, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. It is this reason that a number of pseudo-religious institutions were created during 1789 to 1815 period of the French Revolution and developed different forms of synthetic imitations of Christianity, whose Gnostic characteristic were used to launch terrorism of the Bastille, of the Terror, and of the first modern fascist empire of the Beast Man, Napoleon Bonaparte, as a military warfare capable against nation states. The best way to guard against any such effective resurgence of politicized religious cults, exemplified by the Phrygian cults of Cathar variety and by Martinist cult in particular, is to educate the citizenry. Blah, blah, blah. Uh, this is a long work. I'm trying to. Here's the part about the Cathars. Martinism actually originated in a Gnostic cult of Manichaeism called Cathar, which during the 12th and 13th centuries identified their members as the pure people, the selected few who believed in the ancient heresy of duality of the world based on the cyclical fight between good, the God of good, light of God, and God of evil, darkness of Satan. This was the most important form of Christian heresy that had been fought systematically and successfully by St. Augustine and the original church fathers. Um, it does sound a lot like the process church, too, which came over the United States involved in all sorts of stuff. The Cathar priests were known as the perfects, who claimed to attain trance-like states of nirvana or impersonal states by inducing into themselves and their initiates into what Aristotle had called catharsis, which is the state of trance induced by some unnatural repetitive motion or breathing in some unnatural position or induced by scenes of repetitive violence. Think hesychasm in the Orthodox Church, which was promoted by Gregory of Palamas, who J. Dyer is also a student of. Um, think the self-flagellation of Opus Dei, which even though it was condemned in an early council of the church, the Opus Dei still practice it and claim to be this great conservative Catholic bulwark, which even though they had relationships with the integralist fascists through the circle and also communists, meaning members of the Communist Party were made members of Opus Dei knowingly by Jose Maria Escriva. Um, no, we have to forget about all of that. It's such a great organization. But Opus Dei, E. Michael Jones, some of many other Catholic speakers, um, even probably the unfortunately, because I know people who are involved in this, what's called the Catholic Identity Conference, um, is infiltrated by these individuals. The term catharsis was first coined by Aristotle to identify the effect of a state of perfection brought about by means of dramatic and violent scenes. Now, back to Russian Martinism and the 1905 St. Petersburg Circle, Sophiology circles, the Russian symbolist poets were all studying, and even the philosophers were studying. Um, I mean, these are people associated with uh, Stanislavski. Were studying theater and trying to make theater the new religion of the masses. They were studying Nietzsche. They were studying how to um, turn theater into a Dionysian uh, way of subverting society. And they were studying the interplay of the Apollonian and Dionysian cults. Uh, these are works by individuals. I think Bloch is one of them within the Russian symbolist movement. And these people are in the same salons as these Russian messianic philosophers that are influencing people like J. Dyer, Mark Hacker, etc. Certain Byzantine forms of ascetic practices linked to Greek hermits of the 11th century led to the so-called vision of the divine light of God, hesychasm. Hesychasm. In the solitary retreat of a cave, the hesychast, otherwise known as the ophalophysic, of omphallopsychic, would say the Jesus prayer in a bent position with his chin on his chest and staring down at his omphalos, repeating unceasingly, Lord Jesus, Son of God, have pity on us. While reciting the prayer and controlling his breath in a rhythmic fashion, inhaling on Lord Jesus, holding back his breath of the Son of God, and exhaling on have pity on us, the hesychast would suddenly experience an ineffable sensation of felicity and would find himself enveloped with the power of supernatural white light, and thus experience a vision of God, somewhat like the witness who contemplated the transfiguration of the Christ on Mount Tabor. The difference, however, is that the hesychast had induced this on himself by hyperventilating and was about to lose consciousness. Um, and a lot of these things that involve the chakras, whatever, they are somewhat real. I mean, your nervous system has these centers on your body um, that are related to the dynamics of the body. Um, so if you have some sort of, however, the body allocates energy, if you have some sort of energy in some place, or there's a blockage in some place where generally the nervous system works through what sodium and calcium. I can't remember the whole uh, physiology, but you can get areas where your body's disconnected in terms of, or more disconnected because it's a gradient um, from different parts of your uh, physiology, from your nervous system. And nervous system is related to spiritual experience, but it's not the whole of it, and that's part of the issue with hesychasm. Um, like you can do these things, you can recreate all of these effects. You can recreate some of the good effects with your central nerve. You can probably recreate something like Tai Chi or whatever. At the same time, generally it leads to demonic possession or something like this, as far as I understand. Um, Going on, the Cathars were originally imported into southern France in the Languedoc region from Bulgaria, where was spawned the cult of Bogomils, otherwise known as the Buggers, a radical religious cult that rejected procreation as dirty and sinful, but vented their sexual impulses on each other. They had networks all across Europe and in France, Germany, Italy, Bosnia, Croatia, Bulgaria, and Switzerland. In France, the cult had organized around the estates of the Duke of Toulouse during the papacy of Innocent III. The Cathars began to be chased out of France by local Catholic communities around 1204 at Monsieur Fortress Temple, which their members claimed to have used as a refuge for the Holy Grail. There are close affinities between the Cathars, the Sufis, the Kabbalists, or any other sorts blood of the soil cult. Think Rene Grenon, who is the predecessor to Julius Evola, who is now uh, venerated in all these fascist cults. Uh, and who's venerated by Steve Bannon. Fuck. Olavo de Carvalho in Brazil, the fascist, the advisor to the fascist president there. Um, Alexander Dugin, guy that helps create George Gurdjieff. Um, the fanatical Gnostic and think, why is sodomy such a problem in the Catholic Church? Is it possibly because the Cathar heresy and the Bugger heresy were never stamped out? The fanatical Gnostic Cathars resisted until 1244 when Montségur was taken and most of their followers committed suicide by throwing themselves over the walls. The Cathar tradition, however, lived on among the Templars and different secret societies throughout the ages. During the French Revolution, Martinists such as Joseph de Maistre of Savoy and Fabre d'Olivet of Languedoc and Count Cagliostro of Italy, were the most notorious. During the 19th century, of one of the most active Martinist Cathar leaders was Charles Nodier, who became the Grand Master of the highly controversial Priory of Sion, which believes the Habsburgs are, it explains this, a notorious blood and soil cult which circulated the heresy that Christ did not die on the cross, but escaped with Mary Magdalene and gave birth to the dynasty of the Habsburg emperors. Most of the so-called classical French cultural elites of that period, such as Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, Alexandre Dumas, Delacroix, Gerard de Nerval, were members of the Martinist Cathar cult. Lots of these people, where I had kind of come up with the branches of the Russian Martinist cult that makes up Russian symbolism and these individuals, I did not get to the European ones. These are some of the European Martinists. A reasonable person might think that such a myth is unbelievable, that its exaggeration alone should keep people away. However, this is not the case for the Martinists. Martinists believe that it is precisely because myths are unreasonable that they attract people. They assume that common people will always be attracted because they love to indulge in diversions, which are unreasonable. This is one of the most important lures that the Martinists have been using in their arsenal of lies, and this is the key issue of the Synarchist, Alexander Koyeve, the close collaborator of Leo Strauss, who brought up to attention of Leo Strauss about Roman Emperor Julian in his art of writing. Koyeve based his argument on the underlying assumption that since the very appearance of truth is totally relative in most of the theological myths, the common people will believe in them precisely because falsity can be made attractive when it is dressed up in some kind of attractive form. So, following in the footsteps of Satanist Emperor Julian, Koyeve peddled that perversion, that in matters of theology, most human beings should be firmly believe in things that are perfectly unbelievable. This is why the art of Julian the Apostate and the art of the Straussians are based on the art of lying. As Koyeve put, practically speaking, the ancient art that Leo Strauss had rediscovered consists in writing approximately the opposite of what he believes in order to camouflage what is being said. This is how the current of the, oh, okay, this is about Bush Cheney influences on the Bush administration. I don't need to go into that. Aside from the kookier side of the blood and soil cult, there are certain features of their belief structure which are important to examine, especially from the standpoint of their claim to a Neoplatonic form of epistemology. Again, remember that if you don't know any better, you are disposed to believe in this nonsense, you are a prime target for Satanists. Um, we'll read quickly about Martinism then. During the period of the French Revolution, there were 282 Masonic lodges in France, including 81 lodges of the Grand Orient in Paris alone, 16 in Lyon, 10 in Toulouse, 10 in Montpellier, 10 in Bordeaux, and 6 in Marseille. The Martinist order was founded in Lyon, France, which is the kind of the headquarters of the Front National of the Le Pens, based on the philosophy of the four of the most important Masonic cult leaders of the 18th century: Martinez de Pasquale, Louis Claude de Saint Martin, Jean-Baptiste Willermoz, and Joseph de Maistre. Although Maistre was not a founding member, his participation in the founding period created in Lyon by the three others made him one of the most important elements in the leadership. First of all, what is Martinism? It is a system of philosophical thought, essentially Christian in outlook and tradition, which is chiefly based on the doctrinal tenets of the work called Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings in Their Original Virtues, Powers, and Qualities by a Frenchman of Spanish extraction named Martinez Pascuales. This work gives a particular interpretation of creation, of hierarchy of beings, the fall of man, and the way of man to regain his original status in the scheme of things, so as to be reestablished in initial privileges. Martinez Pasquales considers man to be in exile in this earthly existence, deprived of his powers. Man's main aim must be, therefore, to work, becoming restored to condition that was his originality. Uh, this he can be achieved by following a certain technique, which constitutes the secret plan of Martinez doctrine. This technique was taught to him by the temples of a secret society founded by him, the Order of Ellis Cohen, or elect priests from the rank of high degree Freemasons. Notice they use the Hebrew term Cohen uh, to designate their priesthood. The founding principle is presented as Christian in outlook and Catholic in tradition, but is in fact Gnostic in essence. That is dominated by what should be called Mithric Stoicism, or more explicitly, sadomasochistic initiations, which include human sacrifice rituals. Martinez de Pasquale first created the Martinist order around 1754 in Lyon, France. Pasquale had been the founder of the Order des Chevaliers Masons, Elis Cohen de l'Univers, a Jewish Kabbalistic secret society whose doctrines were expounded in the book entitled The Reintegration of Beings in Original Virtues, Powers, and Qualities, reportedly a pseudo commentary on the Pentateuch. I want to take another side here. Notice the Martinists, you can look so much up on the Martinists on what they actually believe. And we never hear about the Martinists from anybody, whether they be on the right wing, the trad cats, trad orthodox, the left wing, progressives. There's all sorts of people who blame the Freemasons. Oh, the Freemasons made the American Revolution and blah, blah, blah. The Freemasons are behind liberty of conscience. Freemasons are behind liberty of religion. They're behind the destruction of the church, but you never hear about this. Now, of course, the Freemasons, it's the other way around. It was James II who created liberty of conscience um, and then founded Freemasonry, or his form of Freemasonry in France when the Guelphs took over. Um, but these people, they have their complete ideology laid out. It's all there. It's all there. You can read everything that they wrote. And yet, um, these individuals are read by so called traditionalists and fascists and all these people on the right wing, despite the fact that they are trying to create a syncretic movement between Kabbalah and the occult in Catholic Church. And it's simply because that they masquerade as Catholics. They dress up in pretty uniforms that Catholics believe in this thing. Um, so Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who was one of the major influences on Charles Baudelaire, who creates modernité, um, was initiated in Pasquale's uh, Ilu Cohen group in October 1768 by Beaudry de Balzac, and towards the end of 1717, he became Martinez de Pasquale's personal secretary. Saint Martin's contribution to Martinism was to emphasize the inner way, through which one can find the essence of the universe as oneself. The entire doctrine is self-centered, such a way that every man can perceive the life substance behind the universe as himself, just to show how much St. Martin's interest of man is really the interest of me. This quote: Man is the only true witness and positive sign by which the universe, supreme universal source may be known. Man should sound the depths of his own being and affirm the sublimity of his own essence if he would demonstrate the divine essence, for there is nothing else in the world that can do it directly. This is the process by which you become God, the same idea that Archangel Satan had before the fall. This self centered process is also the reflection of the most important influence of St. Martin, which came from the German occultist of the 17th century, Jacob Bohm. After Pasquale's death, St. Martin tried to convert the Ellis Cohen to his personal blend of Christian mysticism, but failed to convert the right and decided to leave the order. Meanwhile, he published several works. His first book has been published 1775 on the errors of truth. Um, Echo Homo, 1972, bunch of books. It is not certain that St. Martin founded an order of any kind. However, there's evidence that found in private correspondences in which one finds references to the existence of a group called Society of Initiates, founded by Jean Baptiste Willermos. And that's where this Martinist movement comes from. I don't want to read all this. Maybe we'll do a deep dive later on and continue. But you can look on Wikipedia at the Martinist order and find the references there and read that stuff. Because there's like pages and pages of how it goes through. It talks about Count Goldenberg of Kalergi being influenced by this, who handed off the um, pan-European Union ideas to Otto von Habsburg. So kind of, if you want to understand why someone like Joseph de Maistre has this traditionalist argument that reason is incapable of making moral and metaphysical, basically incapable of ruling a government, and therefore you have to have a theocracy with a monarchy, is that the aristocrats want to elevate themselves under this Martinist concept that there's only you, that you're the center of the universe. They want to elevate somebody who believes that to be the leader, a kind of typography or typology of like Alexander the Great, something like this. And that's why you get these kinds of so-called authoritarian personalities in all the periods following the French Revolution, all the periods following Napoleon. You don't really have that prior to Napoleon, and it's because behind the scenes there was the Martinists. Um, so CCF and the Thunder God. Another idea that comes out of the Martinists is the god of thunder, and this is something that, like I've said before, E. Michael Jones talks about. Um, I think Hilaire Belloc talks about the distributionists within that area talk about it. Um, Not really a Catholic concept. It's obviously a Roman concept, correct? Um, and a reminder that the new Holy Roman Empire under the Pan European Union under Otto Habsburg was not supposed to be a cross or a Christian symbol. It was supposed to be a sun. So here we go. The CCF and the God of Thunder, called by Stanley Erzol, with Jeffrey Steinberg and Anton Chequin. In 1974, the well-known British psychiatrist Dr. William Sargent published a book, The Mind Possessed, A Physiology of Possession, Mysticism, and Faith Healing. The book was a sequel to the 1957 study, The Battle for the Mind, A Physiology of Conversion and Brainwashing. I will mention that this has a picture of Beatles fans in it, where the Beatles, in the subtitle, and this isn't some kook. This is a major guy associated with Tavistock, one of the forerunners of psychiatry, up there with John Rawling Rees and William James. It has Beatles fans fainting at the Beatles concert, and it says Beatle washing. So if all these people say Dr. James Coleman was an idiot, there's no such connection between Tavistock and the Beatles. Well, here's a connection. We don't have to believe that Adorno wrote the damn things, except that Adorno is tied into those circles, and the Princeton Radio Research Project was involved in basically creating the new concept of popular music, um, alongside all of these Fabian socialist individuals and individuals involved with British intelligence like Hadley Cantrill um, and William Ogilvy. But going on, the earlier book being a how to do it manual for producing a cultural paradigm shift towards an existentialist, irrational dark age society, which was precisely the agenda of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So left wing of the paradigm. In the 1957 study, Sargent had written various types of belief can be implanted into people after brain function has been sufficiently disturbed by accidentally or deliberately induced fear, anger, or excitement. Of the results caused by such observances, the most common one is temporary impaired judgment and heightened suggestibility. It varies groups manifestation or sometimes classed under the heading of herd instinct and appear most spectacularly in wartime during severe epidemics and also in periods of common danger, which increase anxiety and so-called individual mass suggestibility. Dr. Sargent was a prominent British Tavistock Institute psychiatrist who spent 2 decades beginning in the mid 1950s working in Congress for a cultural freedom linked cybernetics group MK Ultra project on the use of psychedelic drugs and other forms of brainwashing for mass coercion. The dramatic events of the 1960s, from the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, near eruption of global thermonuclear holocaust, to the November 22nd, 1963 assassination of President JFK and the subsequent flagrant cover-up, to the later assassinations of Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy. Mentioned Malcolm X, a man associated with H&R Block and also associated with the Knights of Malta, basically admitted that the Knights of Malta were involved. The so-called Black International, which I guess they call that Black International in Soviet circles. Um, to the urban race riots and the mass carnage of American wars in Southeast Asia, transformed the post World War II baby boomer generation from an optimistic, future oriented generation into a collection of irrationalists, babbling counterculturalists, and drug abusers in total denial of reality, just wanting to grill and living from one sensuous experience to the next. When the dust finally settled in the 1960s, the baby boomers emerged with a new set of wildly irrational axiomatic beliefs typified by mass appeal of radical environmentalism and even more widespread belief in consumerism and the magic of the global market. Such ideas have when American was still in production oriented society, but that was before the great shock traumas of 1962 to 71 period. American Dionysians. In preparation for the writing of The Mind Possessed, Dr. Sargent and his team had conducted exhaustive field research profiling modern day primitive religious cults, including a wide range of irrationalist, nominally Christian denominations that particularly proliferated in the most backward rural areas of the American Deep South. This was the America of Elmer Gantry, of the barking dog convulsions, and the circus tent revival meetings. Sargent book drew the parallel between such primitive people under the influence of witch doctors, fundamentalist preachers, and pagan gods, and the victims of 1960s drug rock sex counterculture, describing the historical accounts of celebrations of the ancient Greek pagan god Dionysus. Dr. Sargent wrote, many of the other dancers approached very near trance and showed states of increased suggestibility in the end of a long, intensive period of repetitive, monotonous dancing. They looked very much like fans of the Beatles or other pop groups after a long session of dancing. Indeed, a concluding chapter of The Mind Possessed had a profile. The newest form of fundamentalist religious irrationalism was Beatlemania. One of the clear lessons to come out of the Sargent studies and the similar profiling work of the cybernetics group CCF players, as Dr. Margaret Mead and her husband, LSD experimenter Dr. Gregory Bateson, who helped found and set up the framework for the CIA, may I add, was that the most efficient means of promoting irrational cults was to exploit existing movements and subcultures. In the case of the United States, the British liberal imperialist mindbenders and the American Tory cohorts had a 3-century track record of conspicuously promoting such irrationalist movements to draw upon. Thus, one major form of cultural warfare directed against the Republican tradition of American founding fathers through the British Fabian Society and its later Congress of Cultural Freedom spawn was the revival and promotion of the Great Awakening and related forms of subversion, including most prominently the Lost Cause ideology of the pro British feudalist confederacy, whose credo taken from John Locke was life, liberty, and property. Just think tradition, family, and property. Medieval Catholic version of the same credo promulgated by the British Fabians G.K. Chesterton on Hilaire Belloc was later translated into tradition, family, and property. And if you look at Charles Colombe, one of his flags for the American monarchy is the double-headed eagle, I believe of the Habsburg. I mean, it's a general Holy Roman Empire thing, on top of a Confederate flag with the papal keys and all of that. Beginning early in the 20th century, in tandem with the USA top-down revival of the racist Ku Klux Klan, sponsored directly out of Hollywood with enthusiastic support from Woodrow Wilson. Remember the movie that they put out, both Gone with the Wind and um, Ku Klux Klan movie, Birth of a Nation, were Ku Klux Klan movies. Society promoted Confederate revival aimed not so much at secession as the subversion of the historical American commitment to the Leibnizian pursuit of happiness and the U.S. Constitution's preamble mandate to promote the general welfare. Major players in the Confederate revival would later assume leading roles in the Congress for cultural freedom subversion. The Great Awakening, the God Who Despises Man. During the colonial period, a student of Sir Isaac Newton, John Locke, the notorious Jonathan Edwards, backed by the landowning river gods of the Connecticut Valley, became the chief political opponent of Leibniz, Massachusetts Bay Colony leadership, led by Increase and Cotton Mather. In his mass revival meetings of the 1737 to 41 Great Awakening, Edwards conjured up a kind of monster of God and ordered those assembled to join and obey. Otherwise, he told the crown, God will not only hate you, but he will have you in utmost contempt. No place shall be thought fit for you, but under feet to be trodden down as a mire of streets. Edwards ranted that not only would the individual men be wantonly dropped in the fiery pit of hell or trodden underfoot, but that God capriciously elevated Christian Europe while consigning Jews, who he previously favored, African, the savages of North America, and other whole nations and peoples to the devil. Um, Edwards married his daughter to Aaron Burr, the president of the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton University. Upon the death of his son in law, Edwards himself was appointed the third president of the college. His grandson, Aaron Burr Jr., was to become prior to Dick Cheney, the most vile traitor in our nation's history, our second vice president, the assassinate of the architect of the economic system, the American system of political economy. He was a secessionist plotter and a founder of what became known as the Chase Manhattan Bank, and the founder of the New York Democratic Party. After the Mather's successor, Benjamin Franklin, led the nation through a revolutionary war and the adoption of the Constitution, fanatical cults of Edwards' variety fomented the insanity which led to the Civil War. As Lincoln referenced the story in the second inaugural address, terrorists of the John Brown type claimed God's authority in hacking farmers' families to death to oppose slavery, and equally fanatical groups claimed biblical authority to maintain slavery. Following President Abraham Lincoln's defeat of the British instigated Southern secessionist revolt, the United States emerged as the most powerful agro industrial nation on earth. No longer was it possible for Britain to defeat the former North American colonies militarily. The alternative path was long term cultural subversion. The primary institution through which the British strategy was prosecuted was the Fabian Society, which operated in conjunction with the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable Trust and other institutions, namely the Russian Martinists, French Martinists. The liberal imperial right wing of the British Labour Party on the model of Lord Shelburne's 18th century utilitarian Whigs. The Tony Blair New Labour neoconservative apparatus of today is a Fabian Society dominated continuation of their earlier efforts. Hence, Blair's perfect fit alliance with Dick Cheney led the American neoconservative wannabe imperialists. Varieties of irrational perversion. United States, Southern, and border states, survivors of the Confederacy led by the former Confederate generals Albert Pike, Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, and others organized the Ku Klux Klan and a broader lost cause movement to defend an agrarian, no brains required lifestyle. That's a little rude. During the long reign of Queen Victoria, Steve Bannon wants a return of the Western world, to the age of Queen Victoria, if not to the Middle Ages, as he said. And her son, Prince Edward Albert, later King Edward VII. American collaborators of the Fabian circles, typified by William James, developed intimate relations with the British Fabian institutions, including the Cambridge Apostles, the Royal Colonial Institute, and its associated Scottish Rite Freemasonic Lodge, now the Chatham House Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Society for Psychical Research, the H.G. Wells Allied New Republic magazine, and others. As the founding chairman of Harvard University's psychology department, James helped launch a new dimension of religious insanity beyond the earlier episodic Great Awakenings in a famous series of lectures at Edinburgh University published under the Varieties of Religious Experience. He proposed that Edwards' type of terror-induced religious experience be enhanced with drugs. Borderland insanity, crankiness, insane temperament, loss of mental balance, psychopathic degeneration, he argued, were necessary for creative thought. And these are things that are also shared in the Martinist circles around Nietzsche and others. uh, Including a sense of the spiritual. So it's for creative thought and a sense of the spiritual. He pointed out that the drunkenness had been traditionally the best way to get religion, but added that this suggestion that nitrous oxide, ether, and other drugs also be sought. So that's why watching what the hell's the movie called? The people start turning into lizards. Fear and Loathing, that's a religious experience. In these lectures, James also promoted the British oligarchical sponsored occultist theosophical movement of Madame Helena Blavatsky and Annie Besant, which also around Gurdjieff and Martinism and all of this, and other strange religions which had been promoted to prominence after the Civil War. The fugitives, the Fabian Society, joins the Klan. In 1970, Walter L. Fleming was appointed dean of Vanderbilt University in Nashville. So here's where the E. Michael Jones types, I think, come in. Um, Midwest kind of Catholics that are all over the place. During the preceding years, the college once Southern taken over by a consortium of Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Wall Street financier interests. Vanderbilt and Fleming would provide the launching pad for the fugitives, a literary mafia that would promote a revival of Confederate ideology and wage cultural warfare against the American system, paradigm of scientific and technological progress and Republican statecraft. Beginning in 1920s, the fugitives, that's the name of this consortium, published a literary magazine of the same name. Fleming's most famous work had been his 1905 history of the original post Civil War Ku Klux Klan, which he prepared in consultation with many of the surviving Tennessee Templars who had led the organization. Now, it's interesting, the aforementioned, the Ku Klux Klan was formerly anti Catholic, extremely anti Catholic, but they unite under this Fabian operation with the Catholics, the so-called traditionalists who have all sorts of occult ideas. Um, Fleming, along with other political, cultural, and spiritual leaders, had been instrumental in the 1915 relaunching of the Klan. Now, remember, this is very close to the time of the revolutions, the Bolshevik Revolution. Between the Bolshevik Revolution and the 1905 revolutions in Russia. Uh, so the Klan's launched, promoted through the mass circulation of Hollywood's first full-length feature film, Birth of a Nation, beginning with highly publicized screenings at President Woodrow Wilson's White House and at the Supreme Court. Fugitive's high priest was a Rosicrucian mystic. Wow, really? Sidney Matron Hirsch, Jewish last name. Its temporal leader, John Crow Ransom, had just returned from Rhodes Scholarship Studies at Oxford University. Ransom was well known, at least by his family connection to Dean Fleming, because his great uncle, Tennessee Templar and Ku Klux Klan founder James R. Crow, had been Fleming's chief source on Klan history. In fact, the entire Crow family were KKK, and Ransom cherished his childhood memories of Mama Ella Crow and the other Crow women sitting around the family hearth sewing sheets together for the rallies. This was not an aberration. The core of the fugitive circles and their later literary and political collaborators were descended from Tennessee Templars, officers of Nathaniel Bedford's Confederate Army Critter Company. It's called the Critter Company. The small fugitive circle, in addition to Ransom, included five others: William Yandell Elliott, who was critical, I think, in the education of Henry A. Kissinger, Bill Fearson, Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, and Clayton Brooks. All but Tate were also to be Rhodes Scholars, and Warren Brooks and Tate, along with Ransom's younger student, John Jack Thompson, Robbie Macaulay, and Robert Law, were all to play leading roles in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. At the time Ransom's Fugitive Circle was formed, the main Fabian Society publication was a new journal called The New Age. Gee. Which is tied into Martinism through Ouspensky and George Gurdjieff. Um, which was financed, and also theosophy. The New Age was financed by the Fabian playwright and promoter Friedrich Nietzsche, George Bernard Shaw, and published by theosophist Alfred Richard Orange, who later became a disciple of the Russian mystic George Gurdjieff in the New Age. The works of Fabian Shaw, H.G. Wells, G.K. Chesterton, and Hilaire Belloc appeared alongside those of the leading Satanist of the 20th century, the self-proclaimed Great Beast Aleister Crowley, and assorted other pornographers and mystics like William Butler Yeats, future fascist spy Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and D.H. Lawrence. Now, I don't hate, I always specify I don't hate Chesterton and Belloc. They're fun reads, whatever. But you have to regard this not as conspiracy, but that ideas can be like a virus, and if you don't think critically about the ideas that you take on, they can infect you and lead to unfavorable results. You end up being somebody's political tool. Chesterton and Belloc, though associated with the Fabian Society in the 20th century, were also to become leaders along with Maurice Baring of the Synarchist, pro Spanish Inquisition, pro Roman Empire, pro fascist Catholic grouping known as the Distributists, fellow New Ager and later Nobel Prize winner and major figure of the CCF operations. T.S. Eliot was to ally with them in this effort, as were Ransom, and the fugitives. Um, and one more thing, this doesn't establish that fact, but Cecil Chesterton co-edited New Age with Fabian. He decided the editorial line with A.R. Orge. It's not just contributing to this magazine. During the First World War, Chesterton, Wells, and others of the New Age crowd worked for Wellington House, Britain's main propaganda unit under the Charles Masterman, which was taken over by Lord Beaverbrook in 1917. Now, there's also another house called Electra House, which we already tied to George Gurdjieff, run under the Lord Handsworth. That they were also involved in convincing Catholics in the United States through Canadian press in the United States and in North America and Canada, um, Catholics into supporting British war efforts. And that was one of the foundational agencies to the British Special Operations Executive, which would eventually found the OSS and the CIA. The alliance between the New Age crowd and the fugitives was initially forged by William Yandell Elliot. Once again, I think one of Henry Kissinger's main teachers. During his Rhodes Scholarship term 1922 to 24 at Oxford, Balliol College, he came under the influence of leading Roundtable and Fabian figure A.D. Lindsay. Eliot's subsequent professional career at Harvard's government department and in various congressional and executive positions in Washington centered on the idea of the United States Constitution should be scrapped and the nation reorganized as a section of the new British Empire, an idea derived from Lindsay's Roundtable program. Now, here's another central thing we forget about is geopolitics, which was created by Rhodes Roundtable guy Alfred Mackinder. Geopolitics is the central thing to Alexander Dugin's new movement, and Alexander Dugin is unifying the French, Belgium, British fascist movements in the United States, those movements, Steve Bannon. He's unifying these movements to serve Russian geopolitics. So now here's another idea that needs to be cleaved, where the Gordian knot needs to be cut, is this idea of geopolitics. Because now that this idea virus has spread, everybody's doing it. And everybody's trying to carve out a new empire based on subversive tactics. And I'm sure John Baudrillard has something to say about this. But we'll get to Baudrillard someday. At Oxford, Eliot had consorted with the occultist literary figures of the New Age. He was part of the late-night drinking circles, including Aleister Crowley's one-time lodge brother, the Nobel Prize-winning William Butler Yeats, and longtime fugitive intimate Robert Graves. Future CCF operative Graves is known today for adoring history of the Roman Empire, I. Claudius, and his promotion of the cult of the White Goddess. That's the thought cult. The God of Thunder. Now here's where E. Michael Jones point and the Hilaire Belloc point, Catholic traditionalist point, comes in. In 1928, fugitive and later CCF leader Alan Tate began a 2-year Guggenheim Fellowship team, which took him to London and Paris, where he worked on the biography of Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. There he became intimate with the most curious gentleman, Ford Maddox Ford. Ford had been born into a family of leaders of John Ruskin's pro-medieval pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a precursor to the Fabians, and had become a Fabian Society ally of H.G. Wells. Between 1908, when he was made the editor of the English Review, and his death in 1939, he served as a manager and facilitator of the transatlantic um, literary establishment. His duties include serving as an unofficial Paris host to the expatriate American and British authors there, editing Transatlantic Review for them in the 20s, and serving as a European representative of the fugitives. Significantly, Ford was responsible for forging ties between Tate and the fugitives and the distributionists. In between visits of the hashish scented salon of the later CCF associates Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, uh, where he hobnobbed with Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Nelson Rockefeller's later publicist John Pearl Bishop, and others, Tate coordinated the launching of a new political movement, the National Agrarians. Under the leadership of Ransom himself and other fugitives, 8 years after Mussolini's march on Rome, the agrarians promoted an American brand of fascism, ideologically based on the nostalgic return to the culture of the Confederacy and an embrace of the fundamentalist religious movements, which had been simmering for decades, but capitulated to public prominence by the 1925 Scopes Monkey trial. The Nashville Agrarians. The agrarian movement was launched with the publication of two books in 1930 and one in 1931. The first was titled Synopsium, prefaced by a joint manifesto titled I'll Take My Stand, the South and the Agrarian Tradition by 12 Southerners, the fugitives plus a few additional allies. This was widely publicized nationally and internationally and became the subject for mass radio broadcast debates. Its companion, John Crow's Ransom's God Without Thunder, was his bestial religious manifesto of the movement, the third in the series, Bedford Forrest and His Critter Company, by Oxford trained scholar Andrew Nelson Little, who alternated with Alan Tate in editing in the CCF funded Episcopal literary magazine Sewanee Review, was an unabashed homage to the Klan founder Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, which lied that the Europeans had come to America not for freedom from European oppression and religious warfare, but out of nostalgia for feudalism, of which he declared the Forrest Ku Klux Klan was the highest expression. I'll Take My Stand was an anti American, anti industrial, pro Confederate, pro slavery environmentalist tract. One of its authors, John Gold Fletcher, was associated with the New Age Orage and had been, since 1924, an enthusiastic promoter of Mussolini's New Caesarism. The Agrarians' Joint Manifesto intended all 10 to be support a Southern way of life against what may be called the American way of life, agrarian versus industrial. Ransom added, in most societies, man has adapted himself to the environment with plenty of intelligence to secure easily his material necessities from the graceful bounty of nature. And then ordinarily he concludes a truce with nature. But the latter day societies have been seized, none quite so violently as the American one, with the strange idea that the human destiny is not to secure an honorable peace with nature, but to wage an unrelenting war on nature. This is simply to say that progress never defines its ultimate objective, but thrusts its victims at once into an infinite series. Our vast industrial machine is like a Prussianized state, which is organized strictly for war and can never consent to peace. And then there's some defenses of slavery. I guess this is part of the manifesto, so I should read it. He went on to explain slavery was a feature monstrous enough in theory, but more often than not, humane in practice. Industrialism is an insidious spirit full of false promises and generally fatal to establishments. The attitude that needs artificial respiration and the attitude of resistance on the part of the natives to the salesmen of industrialism. It will be fiercest and most effective if industrialism is represented to the Southern people as what it is undoubtedly is the most part a foreign invasion on Southern soil, which is capable of doing more devastation than what was wrought when Sherman marched to the sea. I will agree that some of uh, the individuals involved with Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln was heavily influenced by theosophy. Um, had bad plans for the industrialization of society. All the same, meaning wage slavery. And this is what some of the individuals talk about who criticize things like integration, etc. But keep in mind that this is a war against, not against wage slavery, but a war against industrialization, a war against the strength of the United States. The concluding statement of the Agrarian Manifesto was by Stark then the best known of the group. Young had not been associated with Fugitive magazine, but he was a Mississippi gentleman, a notorious homosexual, and the son of one of Forrest Critter's company. He was then 18 years into what was a lifetime friendship with H.G. Wells, student and collaborator, the top British cultural warrior and later the head of UNESCO, Julian Huxley. During the First World War, Young had taught at University of Texas, where he became intimate with the circles of Woodrow Wilson, controller Colonel Edward House, and after his academic career was ended by a revelation of sexual preference, he joined the editorial board of New Republic. In his essay, Young bluntly promoted the Confederacy. There was a Southern civilization whose course was halted with the conversions of 1867, by which the Negro suffrage in the South, not in the North, was planned, and the pillaging began. At the outset, we must make it clear that talking of the Southern characteristics, we are talking largely of certain life in Old South, a life founded on the land and the ownership of slaves. The aristocratic implied with a certain long responsibility for others, a habit of domination, a certain arbitrariness, certain ideas of personal honor, with varying degrees of ethics, amour propre, self love, and the fantastic. And it is implied the possession of no little leisure. Whether that was a good system or not is debatable. I myself think it better than a society of bankers and bankers' clerks, department stores, manufacturers and their henchmen and their semi slaves, and miserable little middle class cities. In God Without Thunder, Ransom issues a call to organize an interdenominational fundamentalist super cult along the lines of what would shortly be launched as the Fellowship and later as the Promise Keepers. We wanted a God who wouldn't hurt us, who wouldn't let us, who would let us understand Him, who would agree to scrap all the wicked thunderbolts in His armament. He complained, and this is just the God that has developed popularly out of the Christ New Testament, the embodiment mostly of the principle of social benevolence and of physical welfare. It is the religion proposed by the scientific party. So, as much as somebody doesn't want to be fall to the errors of scientism, uh, the modern cults today, Dyer always talks about and hates on scientism. Um, Most people in the trad circles are hating on science. Now, some of them don't. Some of them hold artistically to a lot of scientific things that are questionable, like vaccines, the effectiveness of vaccines, or the current quality of vaccines. I'm not anti-vaccine at all, but it's unacceptable the current quality of vaccines and the legal um, system set into place to hold nobody liable and to basically keep the quality of vaccines controlled by politics and uh, uh, monetary value, uh, shareholder value. Uh, it is this, he said, which led to the original sin, which he described as a strife between the animal species when man began to enforce the fact of his superiority by militant aggression. He attacked the race of Israel for its commitment to the cities and industrialism and its scorn of nature and the pastoral and agrarian life. His ire was, however, soon directed away from Israel and towards Americanism, charging science as a cult as something of an Americanism. In this, he attacked Franklin's student, the English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, as the prophet of a new God who talks about the triumphs of their science. The horrible critical moment he identified when Occidentalism emerged to glorify the rational principle and deny the irrational principle, thereby leading to Western empire, Western science, and Western business, was the moment when the Roman Church sanctioned the doctrine of Philoloque. So here is an attack by the traditionalist circles around the Ku Klux Klan under the Fugitive magazine and around the Congress for Cultural Freedom, attacking the Philoloque just like the Byzantines and the Byzantine traditionalists. Rancid repudiated a central doctrine of the Christian faith in favor of an irrational God unintelligible to man. And just like obviously, the traditionalist modernist heresy was condemned by Vatican I. After dismissing the possibility that all men will unite under a single thunder cult, either a religion or one of the existing ones hijacked for this purpose, Rancid concludes with the following appeal, which echoes in many fundamentalist religions today. With whatever religious institutions a modern man may be connected, let him try to turn it back towards orthodoxy. Let him insist on a virile God and concrete God and accept no principle as a substitute. Let him restore to God the thunderer. Let him resist the usurpation of the Godhead by the soft modern version of the Christ, and try to keep the Christ for what he professed to be, the demigod who came to do honor to God. No, I'm not exactly in line with the modern view of Christ or the modern view of God, but we're not accepting a pagan God as our God, which is the false dialectic being made here. What the CCF recruiters liked about Ranson was his insistence that the purpose of poetry and all art was to redirect any impulse towards this human quality back to the appetites which man shared with the beast. In his 1938 book of literary criticism, The World's Body, he wrote, "We have elected to know the world through science, but science is only the cognitive department of our animal life. What we cannot know constitutionally as scientists is the world which is made up of whole and indefeasible objects, and this world is the world which poetry recovers for us. The ascetic movement appears as a curious moment of suspension between the Platonism in us, which is militant, always sciencing and devouring. Science gratifies a rational, practical impulse and exhibits the minimum of perception. Art gratifies a perceptual impulse and exhibits the minimum of reason. He was even more direct in 1926 letter to his lifelong friend, CCF leader Alan Tate. Biological man is peculiar in that he must record and use his successive experiences. The beasts are not under this necessity. With them, the experience is an end in itself and takes care of itself. Decades later, fugitive William Yandell Elliott, the trainer of doctors Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Samuel P. Huntington of the Clash of Civilizations notoriety, amongst others, was even more direct. In a discussion including Tate and fugitive Andrew Nelson Little at his 1963 Harvard retirement conference, Eliot explained why he had always wanted the fugitives to write epic poetry and create new myths. Some uses of the myths and symbols, he said, are employed to condition people as to train animals as to train a dog. This is the American symbolist movement that comes out of French symbolism and Russian symbolist cults. The idea that you replace metaphor in poetry with symbols. A metaphor is directed at man creating the concept through being led down a passage, being led by, it's kind of like a riddle, but not necessarily. Whereas symbolism is just barraging the conscience and the subconscious with series of images and the resulting sense that the subconscious and conscious interacting is what makes the sense to that person. And oftentimes, these two things within symbolist poetry are not um, commensurated. They're not the same. They have different values according to them. So a person will act irrationally. Um, in the same period, he was attempting to rouse military leaders. And I imagine this is William Yandell Elliott against the Kennedy administration, saying that although the leaders he needed had to be tough, if they are bred improperly, they are gentle, like a good race horse or a good game cock or a good dog. The flavor of Rancid's religious views is provided by his friend Andrew Nelson Little's remark, prophets do not come from cities, they have always come from the wilderness, stinking of goats and running with lice. Joining the Synarchists. And this is the disciples of Martinism proper. On launching the movement, the agrarians entered into the formal pro fascist alliance with Chesterton Belloc New Age distributionist movement and an implicit alliance through William Yandell Elliott with the Round Table groups whose ideas he promoted from the position at Harvard School of Government with a series of books including The New British Empire and the Need for Constitutional Reform. I believe this is the government that created one of the Trudeaus, or the school, summer school, Harvard Summer School, that created one of the Trudeaus in Canada. Stark Young was immediately invited to a tour in Italy, the Titan by Count Volpi di Misurata, the Venetian oligarch who served as a synarchist controller of Italy's fascist dictator Benvenuto Mussolini. During what he told his friends was the mission in Italy, he met with Il Duce and other fascist leadership, received the knighthood, the Order of the Crown of Italy, and sent back propaganda, notes on fascism in Italy today, to the Wellesian New Republic. The alliance of agrarian distributionist groups was managed by Ellen Tate, Chesterton's leading American disciple, Herbert Alger, and Seward Collins, a follower of the sex psychologist and free love propagandist Havelock Ellis. Collins wished to turn the Bookman Quarterly, which he had purchased, into a fascist propaganda outlet, and he began to bring on Tate and Agar as co editors for this purpose. Between 1932 and 1937, the newly named American Review became what Collins called a form of revolutionary conservatives. Uh, German revolutionary conservative revolution of the same name, including Ransom, Tate, Brooks, Warren, and the other agrarians, as well as Agar, Belloc, and distributionists to provide a sympathetic exposition of fascist economics. The Agrarian Distributionist Alliance culminated with the 1936 publication of Who Owns America, a New Declaration of Independence, edited by Tate and Angar, and including essays by Belloc, Warren, Rancid, Brooks, and others, including distributionist Douglas Jerrold, whom Belloc identifies as Francisco Franco's leading publicist. Gerald wrote in defense of military conquest by Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. Agrarian Donald Davidson wrote in support of Eliot's The Need for Constitutional Reform, which advocated replacing the American constitutional presidency with a parliamentary system under the control of permanent bureaucracy. Charles Colombe says the same thing. E. Michael Jones is a little better of a guy. E. Michael Jones seems to have a lot of independent thought, but still, um, is pro Holocaust shocked, um, the guy that destroyed the German economy through inflation, who was very much involved in the scheme. He wasn't some sort of guy that was opposing um, the British banking system, the Swiss banking system that set this whole thing up. Um, but look at the constant attempt to turn the United States into a monarchy, and look at the people that it involves. The Churchill shift, when as the 30s drew to a close, and mainly British synarchists, notably Winston Churchill, decided that he had to stop Hitler, the Anglophile agrarians and some of the distributionists joined them. This support for the war, however, came with terms. The terms were set forth in 1940 Joint Manifesto titled The City of Man, a Declaration of World Democracy, which, after France had surrendered and Italy had entered the war, urged the United States to join Churchill's Britain in the fight, but only for the purpose of reestablishing a global empire under a single thunder cult renamed the Religion of Democracy. That's a little speculative. The effort was coordinated by Bertrand Russell's top American agent and later CACF collaborator, University of Chicago President Robert Maynard Hutchins. The executive committee included Eliot and Agar. Other singers were Thomas Mann and his son-in-law, G.A. Borghese. The German emigre novelist and Italian refugee were part of the tightly knit circle, including Hutchins, Agnes, the wife of Washington Post owner Eugene Meyer of Lazard Ferres, their daughter Catherine, who, as daughter Catherine Graham, would lead the Washington Post to the powerful position it holds today, and Mann's daughter Elizabeth, who was to become a top United official and Club of Rome member. And remember that the Club of Rome was initially opposed by Lyndon LaRouche's Club of Life, and Catholic circles associated with this, the fake Catholic circles associated with this, attacked the Club of Life for making the pro life movement about more than just stopping abortion, but also making it about stopping deindustrialization and all of these other things, stopping war, etc. Alvin Johnson, an old Texas friend of Stark Young and the Colonel House crowd, and leading figure in the New Republic and Associated News School for Social Research, he set up the New School's University in Exile and École Libres de Hautes Études with Rockefeller Foundation grants, which provided a base of operations for the entire Frankfurt School, emigre apparatus, think Adorno, etc., as well as for fascist ideologue Leo Strauss, who openly promoted official Nazi party theoreticians Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt. The École Libre was home to Raymond Aron, Denis de Rogemont, and others later in the CCF orbit. Appealing to the new millennial cult outlook, the manifesto declared, in an era of apocalypse, we call for the millennium. Universal peace can be found only on the unity of man under one law and one government. This effort, they insisted, must include conquering the heresy of nationalism and dismantling the absurd architecture of the present world. These they would replace with a universal parliament, a fundamental body of law uh, prevailing throughout the planet, and a federal force ready to strike at anarchy and felony. This empire, they insisted, is to be governed by the English law, calling for a New Testament of Americanism. They say, here, more pernicious than all the gold in Kentucky, the treasure of English culture is guarded. The new order requires a reshaping of family, education, association, neighborhood, and church, under the direction of the new religion, the universal religion of democracy. They charge that all the existing churches have meddled in the anarchy of the nations and bowed to the powers that be, and that therefore the hour has struck when we must know the limits are set by the religion of freedom, which is democracy, to the freedom of worship. These ideas, if not the verbatim words, came from the pages of H.G. Wells' The Open Conspiracy, 1928, and Bertrand Russell's The Future of Science in 1931. The pruning of this tree of freedom will not make it less fruitful, the manifesto continues. The organization of learning to train democratic aristocracies requires a firm rooting in the inflexible principles and unshakable values. All of this, they say, requires not only judges, but sheriffs. Their prescription for the enforcement of universal terror is so to start with a coalition of the willing and trusting to do the good of those groups and communities that are progressively disposed to adopt it. As they say, then enforced on the rebels, finally to become the common peace and freedom of all peoples on the earth. I'm just going to keep reading until this is done. I'm almost done. Then we're gonna stop on this note. I think you can probably get the idea of what I want to do. I think doing separate profiles on all of these individuals, Nick Fuentes, all these people, might yield better results because this is all over the place. This is a good kind of expository uh, segment. The City of Man manifesto led directly to the formation of the Fight for the Freedom Community, involving Agar and others, including James Warburg of the Synarchist banking family. Debates were arranged between Warburg of the Hutchins inspired Fight for Freedom and Charles Lindbergh of Hutchins' America First Committee. That's right, America First is in line with the Fabians. Agar served in the Wartime Office of Strategic Services and helped found Freedom House, an organization that is to this day devoted to the idea of imposing democracy by force. Nashville agrarian William Yandell Elliott, remained until his death a proponent of Churchillian English-speaking world empire. Immediately after the war, the Virginia Quarterly Review and the Western Political Heritage textbook he edited for Harvard along with Kissinger, he advocated an English-speaking monopoly on nuclear weapons for the purpose of imposing a world order of the type proposed in the City of Man Manifesto. Warfare Theology and the Fellowship of Fascists. Yet another Anglo-American synarchist operation was launched in the immediate aftermath of the Churchill Tilt against Hitler and the Eurasian fascist blocs. The operation aimed at penetrating Western military and political thinkers through the promotion of a sophisticated God of Thunder cult. The ostensible initiator of this effort was Abraham Vereide, a fundamentalist Christian who had been a leading agitator in Seattle, Washington, against the so-called Red Menace during the 1920s and the early 1930s. One of the weapons Vereide had introduced into the West Coast planner raid psychosis was the prayer breakfast, a vehicle for bringing together business, finance, and government leaders under a broad anti-communist umbrella. In fact, the idea of the prayer-centered networks was first launched in the 1850s by British military officers posted in colonial India. They established the British Officers Christian Union and later the Soldiers and Airmen Scripture Reading Association. 1930 delegates from four nations, Germany, Britain, Holland, and Sweden, met for the first time in Zeeland Castle in Holland and founded the Association of Military Christian Fellowship, AMCF. The first president of the group was Dutchman Baron von Troel. The founders' aim was to establish a non political international fellowship with no visible central organization, no budget, no staff except for the president. The AMCF, over the ensuing decades, would establish branches in 120 nations. The American, the Officers Christian Fellowship, was headed 4 years by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Tom Hemingway, who had been Oliver North's commanding officer in Vietnam and who recruited North to the group. So there's the CNP connection um, to this whole operation. CNP is sub operation of this, and that's probably why Jay Dyer doesn't like to talk about the CNP. I mean, he doesn't know all of this, but I'm sure he knows something of um, the right wing, alt right, new right networks, and doesn't want to attack them because he knows that it's going to cost him his goy bucks on YouTube. Um, Day arrived in Washington D.C. in 1942, and in collusion with British air attaché and officials of the Anglican Church, launched the International Christian Leadership Organization, later to be named the Fellowship Foundation. This group would directly promote the careers of Christian Zionist fundamentalists such as Harold Bredson and his protege Pat Robertson, and would heavily penetrate the U.S. military, the U.S. Congress, and other powerful institutions. International Christian leadership was fully unfurled as a project of the post-war Anglo-Dutch synarchists. When Verade was insinuated as the spiritual advisor to the Dutch royal consort, Prince Bernard um, of Saxe-Coburg-on-Gotha, founder of the Bilderberg Group, and the Britain's royal consort, Prince Philip, the World Wildlife Fund. As Verade's leading protege, Bredson wrote, Verade had won Prince Bernard for Christ. Quite a claim, given that Prince Bernard was the leading wartime Nazi who had served as a secretary on the board of directors of IG Farben, the Nazi chemical cartel. Upon marrying the Dutch monarch Queen Juliana, Bernard had purged the court and installed another former Nazi as his personal secretary to the Queen, Baron von van der Hoeven. This baron's son, Jan Wilhelm van der Hoeven, obtained his degree in divinity from London University in 1980, founded the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, along with Jerry Falwell and other American and British rabid Christian Zionist promoters of the imminent Armageddon. Baron von Toul, who was head of the Association of Christian Military Fellowships, was tapped by Prince Bernard as the Lord Chamberlain for Queen Juliana. The International Christian Leadership organized a Verade, today known as the Fellowship Foundation, runs an international series of prayer breakfasts, maintains safe house residence in world capitals, including Washington and London, and claims a global membership of 20,000 and an official annual budget of 10 million. Now, this is at the time this was written in 2004. In both the United States and Britain, the fellowship also runs the prison fellowship ministries and convicted Watergate felon Charles Colson. The British branch, closely aligned with Conservative Party, also maintains close workout ties with another long-standing Fabian religious front, the Christian Socialist Movement, with which Tony Blair is closely affiliated. Washington sources have identified both current Speaker of the House Tom DeLay and in 2004, and General William Jerry Boykin, the current Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, as leading members of the fellowship. Boykin is under Pentagon investigation for comments he made 2003 at a fundamentalist church calling for the crusade against Islam, which he called a satanic religion, just as he is in line with Knights of Malta, despite the fact that journalist Seymour Hersh was attacked for saying that if Knights of Malta wanted a crusade. You have all sorts of people saying this kind of stuff around the Knights of Malta. In March 2003, Harper's Magazine published an eyewitness account by Jeffrey Charlotte of his tenure as a resident at the Fellowship Communal Mansion in Arlington, Virginia. Charlotte described a fellowship session led by the group's current leader. Verade protege Douglas Coe co-described the covenant of secrecy made between members of the group who operate in cell structures, like the IRA, like the office, not the British, and I'm getting tired. Special Operations Executive, Cell Systems. Uh, Co-describe the covenant of secrecy made between members of the group who operate in cell structures. Co asked the participating fellowship members for an example of such a covenant, and he received an immediate reply. Hitler. Co answered, yes, Hitler made a covenant. The mafia makes a covenant. It is a very powerful thing. Co's son-in-law gave the disciples a brief class on the life of Genghis Khan, describing a particularly bloody incident in which he beheaded his enemies, stuffed heads into crates, and all the while devoured his dinner. Charlotte quoted the young Co. If you are a known friend of Jesus, you can go and do anything. When you have when you leave here, he continued, you're not the only one who's going to know the value of Jesus. You're going to know the people who rule the world. So there is the uh, I don't know. There's somewhat of a debunking of these individuals. The underlying John Brisson says truth or industrial complex that makes up all of these individuals that are constantly going out trying to find places where they can get paid to lecture or constantly going around on the YouTube circuits, just like this guy Alexander Dugin does it. The guy that is a personal advisor to um, the Jair Bolsonaro, fascist in Brazil. Um, you know, hopefully this kind of debunks where a lot of these viewpoints are coming from. The YouTube circuits are the new version of the literary magazines, which were controlled by symbolists and Fabian circles in the early 1900s. Now it's the early 2000s. I mean, more or less 2010s, whatever, 2020s. And we're now being introduced to alt media as the new literary magazines of those days, except now it's almost all vitriol. It's almost all kind of garbage, rehashing, simulacrum. And it's not like even then, you had some creative works, you had some novel ideas, noble ideas. Now it's just, it's something where you want to cut the Gordian knot and say, we're sick and tired of just hearing this confused garble from all these people who are influenced by these Martinist currents, by the traditionalist heresy currents, the post-industrialists, eco-fascists, all of these people that come from the same uh, aristocratic romanticists, um, people that are very much under the idea that the world deserves a Demaistrian purging or a Catharian purging. Thunder God. Now, I'll disrupt you from your grilling for a second. There's one more. There's a little window on this article um, about the God of Thunder and the CCF. I had another article where it quotes all of these different individuals who are members of this, or at least derivative of the Gematria thought about the Thunder God, and it ties it back into this. But this is a little window called Shakespeare Boomers, the CCF and the Boomers Shakespeare. Quote from King Lear: Kent, I cannot conceive you. Gloucester, sir, this young fellow's mother could, whereupon she grew round wombed, and had indeed, sir, a son for her cradle ere she had a husband for her bed. And compassion alike for the afflicted and for those they victimize, in turn, urges us to discover why is it that no baby boomer can read a poem, read that is, except as a farce, either like a nursery jingle or with one or another crazy affection, nor read Shakespeare or Schiller except as a soap opera, Hamlet as an adolescent crisis, Portia as a pure goodness, or William Tell without the crucial redemption scene of the last act. And I think I know where this is going. It's going to talk about symbolism versus metaphor. While more entwined causes come into play than I can indicate here, the Congress of Cultural Freedom deserves much of the blame. The first and earliest definition of art and high culture for every boomer, whether PhD or grade school dropout, came from some part of the CCF's artistic table. It is not necessary to study Stravinsky or Schoenberg. Almost no one does that after all. It should be almost self evident that you need not to have read any of T.S. Eliot's poetry yourself, for instance, to absorb a precise impression of him or his equivalent from the general cultural ambience. To grant that much, however, only raises a second and more puzzling question. How is it that the first impression has perpetuated itself through so many decades, even among the most promising boomer cases? What is it that has prevented these old grayheads, through the entirety of their lives to date, from ever being able to read Heine, Keats, or Shelley except through James Joyce's eyeglasses? To begin to approximate the answer, step back a moment and remember some larger considerations. Commitment, which is natural to every human being, is effective commitment to the truth and the good, as to two sides of one and the same thing actually. Every man and woman is naturally a Platonist to that extent, and the artistic tradition of the globally extended European civilization is Platonic. The man or woman who is an artist, still more a great artist, has greater commitment to the truth and to be good, and greater power to make it effective. But what do the spawn of the CCF say? Take the writers I was almost familiar with. Take the writers I was most familiar with as an adolescent, like T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden. Go down the whole CCF list, take any of them for all their many and real differences, with only the occasional odd exception which proves the rule. Every one is a fanatic apostle of the dogma that effective commitment to truth and to the good is simply impossible. Every one of them, in some way, a crippled and perverted soul. And this is exactly the same thing with the Russian um, symbolists in the Sophiology movement. They wish to make Sophia, wisdom, their whore, just like uh, was it Solanov? Let me look back at my old photos here. Yeah, just like Solovyov, who is one of the big three influences of Alexander Dugin. Um, Everyone, in some way, a crippled and perverted soul, pressing us to believe that such is the very essence of art. But when then becomes a Keats and Shelley, Mozart, Bach, any artist, the insuperable gulf separates them from the boomer. Indeed, every boomer understood long ago that the conviction that the human natural commitment was impossible was the open sesame without which no one could enter the Elysium of the artist. It is the Masonic handshake of the artsy fartsy subspecies of boomer. Um, Prudence whispers, by all means adopt the best, the latest, and the most approved opinions of whatever set you find yourself in. But do you really want to throw out all the old trusty magic ring once and for all, and to throw it out right now, just as you're reaching retirement age? There are other and perhaps deeper issues. Start with the fact that the boomer is sincerely unable, no matter how hard he struggles, to find any difference between the sort of platonic commitment I reference on the one hand and the endorsement of an approved list of positions on the other. The blindness of his is the same as his nearest cousin, the religious fundamentalist of the type of the Pat Robinson follower or Mel Gibson groupie. They talk about Lyndon LaRouche. Those who accuse LaRouche of violating the rules of punctuation have completely missed the whole thing, what the whole thing is about. Um, the artists of the Cultural Congress for Cultural Freedom swing back and forth between the soulless mathematical formalism of Arnold Schoenberg and the wild irrational emotionalism of the abstract impressionist sociopathics like Jackson Pollock. Bertrand Russell once wrote that having been reared in the Victorian stolidities, he found it difficult to accept as an old man a world dominated by America. Indeed, after the Civil War, the United States became the world's greatest economic power and was growing apparently without limit. The British Empire was becoming a has been relative to those who even spoke English. Are we going to have a world dominated by these hicks and rubes? How do we stop it? Now, from his fight with A. and Whitehead around Principia Mathematica, Russell knew that there do exist axiomatic paradoxes and that they are linked to scientific discoveries. Now, how can we stop them? How? We must outlaw anything conceptual. In this sense, the CCF goes back to Socrates and Plato's opponents among the ancient Iliad, Attics, the sophists and Aristotelians, to Polysarpi of Venice, his puppet Galileo, and later student Thomas Hobbes, to Francis Bacon's campaign against Shakespeare, to Shakespeare, who actually rewritten to soap opera in the 18th century, as the boomers do today, only to be revived in Germany. Thus, in this sense, the CCF is an old story, but as Heine wrote, it's always new. Okay, so that was a little obscure to people not familiar with the LaRouche movement. They had a cultural side to a political movement. So, um, but the fundamental category is I think that pretty much the exposure culture too in the alt right, and you did this and you did that, and you don't accept this one tenet of my theology or my one tenet of my alt right cult. It's kind of just like this whole boomer thing. And it's the kind of thing that Jay Dyer does or Neil Michael Jones does in order to fit into a marketable and supporting lifestyle. You know, they need to eat too. So they kind of toe the lines. And in that way, they all fall into this cybernetic organization, which doesn't really even need a conspiracy to keep it together. You just can't ask questions. Um, no, I think I've gone on long enough. Um, Let me see if I can find the quotes about the Thunder God cult and all of these other individuals because it's kind of good. You can read that. If I don't find it in a second, I'm going to call this quits. Where's this? Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for Brisson, John Brisson, stopping by. I probably droned on so long, but there's still 3 people. I'm very glad that you stayed along with that because that's probably pretty tough to sit here and watch me rant for hours on end. But I got 4 likes. Thank you very much. And please like and subscribe. Love you guys all. God bless you. And thanks for watching. Hopefully, we can turn more people away from the kind of uh, post industrial, pro aristocratic society that's being promoted by all of these individuals that are all caught up in one big nebula. And hopefully, we can. Get people just to think critically about things and form their own opinions based on an actual understanding of history, which I think is kind of the what the truth movement's supposed to do, and instead focuses on developing dogmas about history and trying to find the last place where there was a hero and cling on to that hero as desperately as possible. All right, have a good night. God bless you all. Bye.